Record
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us for the screening of the Beaver Believers tonight. For any of you who are watching this after the fact, if this Q&A inspires you to want to watch the film, you can go to thebeaverbelievers.com and you can read about it and watch the film there. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump in.
I believe there have been some questions posted
All right.
in chat.
Do you want me to just sort of look at the chat and answer them as I see them, or do you prefer to sort of
Usually Ed Gertler runs this.
Ed? All right, Ed, do you
Yes,
want
Ed.
to jump in and be our MC?
Yeah, that's why I was wondering whether you could directly access chat. Listen, before I go to some of the other people's chat, um, I want to bring up something from our prior conversation. Uh, as a filmmaker, you're just supposed to be a messenger, but you were telling me you become a go-to source for beaver issues. Would you care to elaborate on how this has changed your life?
Sure. Well, so I think I've had sort of a maybe slightly more circuitous and diverse path than some folks. So I started out in environmental science and environmental policy, and I chose to then go into filmmaking to be the mechanism and the way in which I would, be noodling in these issues to focus on the communication side about them. So I've always felt that, yes, I love making films, and I love, as you said, sort of being that fly on the wall messenger of a story. But that's always only just been part of what I do. I've always also still continued to be, engaging on issues, serving on nonprofit boards, be helping with consulting, be working directly with agencies, with nonprofits, with public-private partnerships, across the whole gamut of just operations and organization and internal projects, as well as then just how do all of these groups learn to better articulate the work that they're doing. But there's something about the Beaver story that, yeah, you said how it changed my life. It definitely took over my life. And I really feel like the reason is because the whole greater story of beavers in the reference to climate change and the degree of riverscape degradation that we face and water insecurity that we face, it's really one of the few positive, hopeful stories. And I think that we just crave feeling that there's some hope. There's something we can actually do that's good. And so much of the environmental movement is pointing out all the ways that every single thing that we do to take care of our physical human bodies is bad, right? We're eating the wrong thing, we're consuming too much. By keeping our temperature comfortable, it's bad. By driving around and having transportation, it's bad. It's like every single thing we do for our animal body is bad. And yes, maybe it is. Maybe we are completely over consuming and doing a lot of things that need adjustment. But we also have to feel like we belong on this planet and have a way to be here where we can contribute positively. And I think that that's the thing with the story of beavers is it feels like we can partner with them, we can get involved, we can help them, help us, help every other little thing. Like we desperately need that. And so I've kind of latched onto that notion as the core inspiration of the entire process-based riverscape restoration movement, what we call now adaptive management or nature-based solutions, ways to be sort of putting the reins back in nature's hands, but recognizing we've messed things up so badly, maybe it needs a little help from us first. Maybe we can kickstart some of these processes. Maybe we can do things like pull back the fences, rip out the dikes, upsize the culverts, pull back some of the roads, pull back the cows. There's so many things that we can do to help facilitate letting nature really come back in and handle its own healing. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey, and through all that, there was, if you're interested in more of this process-based riverscape restoration, if you go to a website, it's restoringriverscapes.org. That was a project I collaborated on with NOAA Fisheries West Coast last year. And it was a 3-day virtual workshop with 85 presenters, folks from the entire gamut of fire to floods to salmon to riverscape restoration to the Elwha Dam, the Klamath Dam, farmers, ranchers. I mean, just everything you can think of. Urban restoration, you know, these little pockets of reconnecting floodplains and wild areas in urban centers. That really inspired me to want to dig in deeper. So yeah, I have gone back to school now in my mid-40s to pursue a PhD as it's a field called translational ecology. And so it's really digging into the hardcore science, but then how do we get that out of academia, locked away in the ivory tower, and how do we get that translated into real world applications for practitioners, for agencies, for everyday folks? How do we get it to be like a two-way knowledge exchange, a co-production of knowledge, where all of the place-based knowledge, the traditional ecological knowledge, you know, all of that can also be valued and integrated with what's coming out of academia. So yeah, my friends are jokingly calling me Dr. Beaver. So we'll see. I'm only one semester into about 5 years. But so far it's been fantastic. So yeah, I'm in the lab of Dr. Joe Wheaton at Utah State University at the moment. So
Okay, well, I'm gonna keep on telling you all my beaver stories. It's
please do.
well, I will read the chats just so the other people can get their questions. What does it say? I'm chatting as a guest. Here I posted. I don't know what that means.
Well, I can see all the chat if you.
Yeah, well, that would be good because I thought
Okay.
I could get them, and for some reason, it's blocked out by this message. So
Maybe okay, maybe because I'm a co-host, so I'm seeing more than you are. I'm not sure, but
maybe.
okay. So I'm seeing a question asking about the success rate for beaver relocations with the people I was filming, and that's a really fantastic question, and actually something where, you know, you make a film and it's dated, right, for the knowledge of the time, and then that was a few years back, so we know a lot more now. So success rates, there's this really interesting tension in the beaver community right now about live trapping and relocating, because on the one hand you could say, okay, well, if there's beaver in an area and they're set to be killed, well, anything you do is better because they're about to be, you know, trapped or shot like tomorrow. So great, get them out of there, put them out in nature. And yeah, even if they get eaten, you know, by a wolf or a cougar, well, great, they're at least contributing back to that system of, you know, natural processes. There's some incredible work coming out of the Voyageurs wolf project. It's up in Minnesota at Voyageurs National Park about the relationship between wolves and beavers. I mean, beavers are like a 50 to 60 pound hunk of the best protein any predator could want. So that's, you know, that's valuable, right? Like, that's a good dinner. But I think with some of the rising popularity of beaver, the keynote talk I actually just gave on Tuesday was sort of looking at, have beaver become a fad, and what's the potential downside of that. So I get a lot of emails from folks that are like, hey, I have this creek, it's bone dry from June to September, can you send me some beavers? I'd like to put them in it so they can fix it. And it's just like, oh gosh, you know, there's a risk when something goes so far into sort of like the popular culture, when we reduce everything to a tweet or a TikTok. You can't drop a beaver in a dry stream bed. There's no food, there's no shelter, like they'll die. That's torture, you know? So that's, I think, where there's a lot of work being done now, looking into those process-based restoration techniques, what you saw in the film on the Bridge Creek scene, where they were putting in those posts and reinforcing dams. There's another technique called a PALS, which is a post-assisted log structure, and it's really meant to emulate just like a natural woody debris jam. recognizing we need more structure, we need more food, we need more water depth, we need more going on in the stream in order for the beavers to be able to be translocated and to be successful. There's also a lot more that's gone on understanding their family dynamic and how critical it is that if you are going to move them, if you move them as a whole family unit, they're far more likely, if they have what they need, to kind of hunker down and immediately make a home, as opposed to if you're taking a 1 or 2-year-old dispersing juvenile. Well, their instinct is to go find a mate. They're not going to stay where you put them. You know, like how many 22-year-old guys suddenly start making a beautiful, you know, home. They're not into that yet. They're going out to the club. So there's a lot of variance. There's also some really interesting variance in terms of top predators, carnivores. So some of these areas that might seem like they're better for beaver translocation because they're far more wild, well, hey, that beaver's getting knocked off by a cougar or a wolf that night, as opposed to an area that maybe seems maybe less suitable in one sense because it's been more damaged. But if it's already a lot more populated and there aren't as many top carnivores, well, then maybe the beaver don't have that pressure of being somebody's dinner. And so they are more likely to succeed. A colleague of mine, fantastic, brilliant woman, Molly Alves, she runs the beaver program for the Tulalip tribe in Washington State. She just finished her master's actually here at Utah State University, really digging into the success of coexistence, the success of translocation, of live trapping and translocation, and all the different things that we can do and when it's appropriate and how to do it better. I think overall, most everybody would agree, if you can let beaver move into an area on their own, that is still the golden ticket because they build the habitat and push it out ahead of themselves, right? So the way that they build the dam, they flood the area, the plants recruit, the willows pop, they get that water depth. They're pushing out safety in front of them. And so if you get those dispersing 2-year-olds, juveniles, that start getting out and pushing the habitat and expanding the habitat, they're deciding on their own terms what feels safe, where they want to be, what's a good thing to do. So that's where we really are kind of focusing more effort as much as we can onto making areas seem enticing, doing what we can as humans playing beaver for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, however long it takes. I mean, if we've got 200-300 years of degradation, it's maybe not unreasonable to think that it's going to take us 2 to 3 years, you know, to try to get things trending back in the right direction. That's the best way. But I think that's one of the things where we can have some really interesting conversations about ethics, about treatment of animals. You know, what is the right thing if they're going to be shot? Is it better to try to take them and relocate them? It's a great, curious question about what do we do? But there's some fantastic work being done, kind of exploring all those different issues. So we just kind of got to keep seeing what comes out of it, I think. Someone just affirmed that helping share the story about how beavers help as opposed to being a pest is important. I agree. That's a lot of the translational ecology work that I'm studying right now, is how can we frame messages so that we don't want to seem like we're talking down to people. We don't want to seem like we're criticizing people. There clearly has been a culture for several hundred years that beavers are a pest, and you're being a good person. You're being a responsible neighbor, right, by trapping them out. So there's a lot of work being done to try to figure out how can we also acknowledge the harm they can create to human infrastructure, because, oh my gosh, it can be striking how quickly they mow down all your favorite apple trees, or suddenly your culvert is plugged and your road is flooding, or your basement is flooding. Or there was a call I went to outside of Portland, Oregon. These beavers started taking down Pinot Gris vines in a vineyard, right? They cut down the amount of vines that was something like 10 cases of wine in like a week. And the vintner was like freaking out, you know, he's like, this is so expensive, I don't want to kill them, what do I do? And we actually were able to put in a little tiny beaver sized electric fence just along the edge of the vineyard. You know, so it's just like, we need to validate they can be a pain in the butt. Because they like to occupy the same space we like to occupy. We like to be right there along the creek front. You know, we do not give our creeks and rivers enough space anymore. So there's going to be conflict. So I think it's also that balance of validating conflict, figuring out where can we back up when it's appropriate, where can we give nature more space, the river more space, let it remeander, let it flood. Like when we build in the floodplain, hello, it's called a floodplain, you know, for a reason. It's supposed to flood. That's healthy. That's actually how nutrients get back up there to revitalize everything. So again, it's all complicated, but it's all pretty fun to dig into if we can figure out how to do it respectfully and politely. We got a question. Please talk about beaver on high volume, not to clean rivers. Beavers on the side channels of the Potomac. I'm gonna just presume, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand that question. I'm gonna assume we're getting at beavers and water quality. There have been some fantastic studies that have really dealt with all the different ways that beaver wetlands filter water and improve water quality. And that's a big one for you all on the Potomac, Chesapeake Bay, that whole area. A lot of times where we have in the past had mining, when we've had logging, when we've got intense agriculture, even road building, there's a lot more sediment that's getting flushed out into the river systems. You're having everything wash out from the roads, you know, all of the pollutants out of towns. There's a new chemical that's just been realized to come off of car tires, where it was a shift in the makeup of how we do tires so that they don't fall apart as quickly. So that's good on the one hand, but it actually turns out to be lethal to coho salmon. So when we have all of this junk, you know, flowing into our waterways, most of the ways that we treat water in like water treatment facilities, it's actually emulating natural processes. And a lot of that is microbial and biotic. And it turns out that's what beaver dams and beaver wetlands do naturally. So whether it's vegetation and the way that the roots are actually uptaking particulates, or that the pollutants can sort of glom onto soil particles. And then if you think about the velocity of flow when you encounter a pond, a beaver dam pond or a wetland, the velocity slows. And so more of that sediment falls out of suspension. So that's then getting rooted down. I sort of describe beaver dams almost as like a big coffee filter. So there's a lot of studies where it's even just showing jugs of water above and below. One looks, you know, murky and yellow brown, and on the downside of the dam, it's crystal clear. So even in urban centers, it's pretty incredible where if we can give them enough space so that they're not flooding out something that's a really critical piece of infrastructure, the amount of water quality and improvement they can do, it's just mind-boggling. If you really want to geek out on it, you can Google the city of Gresham, Oregon. Their watershed scientist, Katie Holzer, has done some remarkable monitoring to show they had beavers actually move into a multi-million-dollar stormwater runoff treatment facility. And at first everybody freaked out because they're like, this thing was so expensive and the beavers are rearranging it and it's deep here and the water's going over there and what the heck's going on? But she was able to just sort of calm everyone down and say like, well, why don't we just look at the science? Let's look at the water quality. Let's look at the particulates, look at the pollutants. Let's see what's happening. And they realized they had like an 80% increase in success of water filtering with the beavers in there. So they decided to leave them because that water runs right out into the Columbia Slough, which then goes into the Columbia River. So it's a challenge. Beavers make a big mess, and we as humans don't like big messes, and they can kind of be unexpected, and we like to feel like we're in control. But for the most part, if we can find a middle ground, it's better for us as well as them, as well as all the other critters. We have a question from Bill. Okay, more of an observation than a question. Curious about beavers. They're curious about you. Yeah. Okay, so it was an observation about how docile they are. So I actually personally wrestled a little bit with how much of Sherry Tippy's snuggling of the beavers to include, because she's an anomaly. Some people call her a beaver whisperer. I would never encourage anyone to go up to any wild animal, especially a beaver. I mean, they can be 60 pounds, right? You could get so if you notice the Met Owl Beaver Project, they weren't snuggling the beavers. They definitely always were using gloves and cages and traps and, you know, the beaver bag and being much more cautious. But it is true most of the time. Once you do have a beaver, they're sort of just like, hey, you know, what are you doing with me now? However, there are a few, and I've seen and filmed, and you know, it's just like some of them are just like, nope, and they'll, you know, wiggle their way out of there. You have to be really careful when you are around their lodges when they have young kits. They will be very protective as parents, as any parent is of their young. And also beavers are actually quite territorial against each other. So they make scent mounds and they protect their territory. This is actually this is one of those educational pieces where we can help folks not be worried they're going to overrun an area like rabbits or mice that just, you know, breed on high speed. Beavers have 2 to 5 kits a season. The kids stick around for 2 years and then get the boot. So usually the biggest beaver family is like 12 max, 6 to 12. They kind of self-maintain, they self-regulate, they mark their territory based on how much food availability they need, how much space they need. So yes, it's one of those tricky things. It's sometimes amazing. I've also found in areas like in parks or near boardwalks, if they're sort of more used to people, sometimes they come out, I feel, earlier in the afternoon or evening and stay up later into the morning. Sometimes when I'm out in areas where I know, you know, I'm looking over my shoulder for cougars, those beavers are so skittish. So it really varies on where they are. But it is pretty sweet to see that sometimes it seems like they're sort of like, all right, yep, that drainage ditch kind of sucked as a house. I don't mind if you take me to the woods. That sounds better. They just kind of like plod along. Oh, we got a golf course observation. Oh my gosh. The number of times I have been called to go help people with golf courses. Golf course owners don't like beavers. It's true. So there's been multiple situations where I think it again, just I would summarize the big picture as it comes down to control. Like there was a golf course outside of Portland, Oregon, where the beavers moved into the water features. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, you have all these natural creeks flowing out of the beautiful Cascade Mountains. You've got these ready-made ponds right there. There's all this lush vegetation. What beaver wouldn't think they could just hunker down? But again, I think it really came down to whether or not the beavers were allowed to stay and it was a fun thing for the golf course, or they were trapped out and it was seen as a disaster. Just if folks could really separate it's different or I'm not the one who controlled it from, oh my gosh, it's bad or we need to get rid of it. In one instance, they realized they could just put in a few culvert protectors. There's sort of these ways to make fences that just sort of discourage the beaver from trying to dam up the culvert to make the pond even higher. But in one situation, it was very tragic. The golf course superintendent, I try to rarely criticize people, but I will criticize this guy. I don't know what kind of schooling he got, but they had a natural creek running through the golf course. So it's like it wasn't a pump. It wasn't man-made. He wanted the water flow to be consistent year round. I don't know if any of you have been to Portland, Oregon. Winter, it rains. It rains, it rains, it rains, it rains, it rains. Of course, that thing is going to have elevated flow in the winter. And then all summer, it's 100 degrees and there's no rain for 6 months. The water level's going to drop. And he was like blaming the beavers. And it was just absolutely ridiculous. But there was no talking sense into the situation. So they decided to rip out the culvert protectors and trap and kill all the beavers. And then guess what? The next summer, their ponds were gone and they just had little muddy pits. And then the next winter, everything still flooded because that's what the rivers do. So it's tricky. The golf course mentality is kind of it's a strange thing. I've actually been kind of curious about the sports that we have that were only possible because of a degraded system. I mean, kind of an interesting look at kayaking out here. When people go kayaking on mountain streams, there should be so much wood and trees down and wood jams and like all these things that are terribly dangerous for that kind of whitewater kayaking. Yet that sport only came to be once we cleaned all the wood out of the rivers and then terribly degraded them. I mean, it's interesting to me when fly fishers, they love the fish, the beavers create the habitat for the fish. Some fisher people see the complexity of all the willows and the thickets and the log jams. They see that as sort of like a challenge to be more precise with their casting. Others kind of get annoyed at it and just want a very simple system because it's easier to fish in, yet that's also not providing that heterogeneous habitat that the fish need for all their different life stages. So we're curious, us humans, you know, we like what we like and we contradict ourselves. And I just say we have to approach it all with grace and understanding and try to keep learning what we can and just take a breath before we pass judgment, but try to weigh the pros and cons of all of our situations and what we want. We have a question about identifying places for location, and that's a really good question. So again, Sherry Tippy, the hairdresser there in Colorado and Denver, she kind of got grandfathered in, and again, she is an anomaly, but she did still have to check in with the Colorado, I think over there it's called the Division of Parks and Wildlife or Wildlife and Parks. So if she could find areas on private land, so the family that was moved in the film, that was to private ranch land. So she did still have to put in the paperwork and let them know where the beavers were going from. She's on a contract from the city of Aurora and the city of Denver to pull out, problem beavers. So because that was going to private land, that was approved, but she did do an assessment to make sure that there weren't existing beavers in the area right where we put them, because like I said, they are pretty territorial. So she'd had a few families like much further upstream and much further downstream, but we did a little bit of an assessment to make sure that there weren't any right nearby. So that would seem like a safe spot to put them. There are sometimes calls in from different agencies, so from Park Service land, Forest Service land, out where I am, sometimes BLM land or state DNR, Department of Natural Resources land. Sometimes they'll have identified sites where that's part of a restoration plan that beavers could be put there. Again, there's been a lot of monitoring, a lot of assessment up front of, okay, this is a semi-degraded area, it could benefit from beavers, but confirming that there is enough food and shelter and such that it wouldn't be considered like an animal cruelty situation where you're dropping them off somewhere where they would immediately die. We've got the funny situation in the States where the wildlife of a state is managed by every single different state. So every single different state has a different way it handles its wildlife. So live trapping and relocating animals is so complicated because every single state has its own whole system on, can you even do it? Do you need to take a class? Do you need to be certified? Does it need to be a state game warden? Does it need to be someone in pest control? It's really sad to me how many places it's totally legal for anyone just to take a shotgun and kill an animal, but heaven forbid you live trap it and try to put it somewhere where it could be more successful. That's suddenly now illegal. Horrible, painful example. This is far away from you all. I don't know if you've seen it in the news. There was a situation in Wyoming where a man, so wolves were delisted as an endangered species in Wyoming. A guy ran over a young juvenile female wolf, totally injured her, grabbed her, duct taped her mouth shut, dragged her to a bar, showed her off, a bunch of people started kicking and torturing this wolf and just beating it up, and then they videotaped taking it out back and shooting it. And he got like, I think it was only like a $200 fine, and it was not for the torture or the killing or the running over. It was just for possession of a wild animal, and him torturing it and killing it was totally legal because wolves are listed as a predator. And this has just been blowing up the news out here, and tons of people are testifying and writing letters. A group called Western Watersheds is trying to bring it into a lawsuit just to say, like, these laws are not making sense. Animal cruelty, basic recognition that these are living beings. Like, you would be thrown in jail if you did that to your husky dog, yet he did it to a live wolf. I mean, there's so much more work we need to do to look at the greater context of what are living sentient beings? How do we handle wildlife? You know, yes, you don't want to have any random person. You know, back in the day, there's video footage from like the 30s of people picking up beavers by their tails and putting them in horse saddlebags, but then taking them up to the mountains to relocate them, because even then they realized that they were doing good for the soil and the water. Now, very not okay. Any state agency would get massive fines if you picked a beaver up by the tail and shoved it in a horse saddlebag. Or I mean, if you Google Idaho Fish and Game parachuting beavers, they actually had a beaver named Geronimo, and they were dropping beavers in boxes with parachutes out of airplanes to get them out of the lowlands away from farms and back up into the headwaters. I mean, so it's like just how we think about what is and is not okay with wildlife and how they're treated. And I mean, it's fascinating. It's horrifying. It's heartbreaking. It's heartwarming. It's all the things. You know, how do we value life and how we treat critters? So I don't know. I think we're just learning as we're going, and hopefully we can try to expedite the permitting and the processing of things that are found to be beneficial and beneficial for the animals, as well as beneficial for the greater ecosystem and for us in terms of climate adaptation and water quality. But hopefully we can have laws that make sense and regulations that make sense to also prevent harm and prevent needless suffering of all critters. Sorry, that ended up being a very long, rambling statement, but we think about this a lot. I mean, even right here at Utah State University, we have a beaver translocation facility. And we are having these conversations, you know, weekly, daily, like what is the right thing to do? You know, how do you turn something that is so nuanced and every case is so unique, and how do you turn that into just like statewide policy? It's very tricky. Let's see. I think I've hit everything in the chat. Anyone want to hop in with something else? Or I mean, honestly, at this point, if anyone wants to just unmute and pop your video back on, I'm more than welcome. Any other questions or comments or anything?
How did you manage to get that footage from Duck Dynasty?
Ah, so it was online and I copied it. There's a thing called fair use. So that clip was a montage and it was under 30 seconds that I compiled. And so in documentary, there is a legal allowance where when you are making commentary on pop culture or making a commentary on something. So like if I had used their footage pretending that it was my footage that I had shot, that would be considered a copyright infringement. But in that case, where it was treated and it was clearly making a critique of it and it was credited as theirs, that is then considered something that filmmakers can put into documentary to be making a statement about the state of the world and those opinions and beliefs and outlooks at that time. So same thing for the news footage montage at the beginning. So yeah, there's if you Google fair use, but it was a really interesting series of legal conversations that led up to that. But it basically was allowed because people that are telling stories of news, stories of culture, reflecting on where we're at in society, needed to be able to show enough of that footage or music or context or imagery or whatever that they're talking about to be able to do so. I'm assuming I'm small enough potatoes, none of them would ever have anything to say. Also, part of why I used that, and that's another interesting point where I've had many, many conversations and reflections on like, am I glad I used that clip, you know, now several years later? I wish I would have included and found footage and found a person that was like a good trapper, you know, like a respectful trapper. I mean, trappers and hunters are at the core of the conservation ethos. And sure, some folks think, you know, be vegan, never eat any animal, never kill or hunt or trap or fish anything. But I think the film really could have been strengthened by the perspective of a conscientious and respectful trapper. Same thing, I did get to meet a couple of really great ranchers that were coexisting with beavers, but just there wasn't anything happening at the ranch. It was just like a little chit chat. Like it just didn't work to make a scene out of it. So there are certain choices I still kind of wish like, yeah, I kind of wish I would have done that different. But I would never, ever, ever go film with someone acting as though I was there to share their story, just sort of openly and honestly, if I then intended to make them look bad. And I wanted to share that perspective because I get asked so many times when I'm sharing this with communities that are more environmentally minded or do care about critters and wildlife. They're shocked that people like that still exist. You know, they're shocked that people go shoot things to watch them suffer for fun, or that people truly can still be like that callous. And so the fact that they are the ones that portrayed themselves that way, like they self-produce their own show. That is exactly how they wanted to be perceived. I was like, well, great. All I'm doing is showing them exactly as how they are. So to me, that felt like one of the most ethical ways I could include a reminder that there truly are folks like that. And we all then need to decide, do we try to engage with them? Do we hope it's a small enough population we can just ignore them and write them off? How do we, you know, like I'm all about collaboration and bringing people together and trying to talk across divides, but I really don't know that I would have the tools to know how to talk to those kind of folks. So I just felt like that was an important perspective to kind of remember what we are up against with how some people treat the natural world and have total disregard for sentient beings existing for their own sake. So, yeah.
I've got a question about the watershed that Beaver like. I've done a number of backcountry trips in Labrador, Quebec, and British Columbia, and it seemed that they tended to stay off the main stem of the river, but they would go dam up the side streams.
Yeah.
And yet again, in a main stem, if you got down into an area that ponded up and pooled, there were areas they would build homes in there, but then the flow rate would be low. So is there a correlation to flow rate or gradient that makes
Yeah.
some areas better than others?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you nailed it. So chances are along those main stem, higher velocity, larger flow areas, they'll make bank dens. So they'll still have an underwater entrance, which is how they're safe from predators coming in, but they'll just dig into the bank. So if you ever can either peek over the side or pull a boat, you know, up to the edge, you might still see the signs of nibbling and little beaver chewed sticks and, you know, cut down trees that they're just pulling in for food. You might still see scent mounds to be marking territory. But yeah, here with the Deschutes, the Willamette, the Columbia, the Snake, we've got lots of beavers or even streams that should, right? So if a stream is meandering and anabranching all over the place, right, the gradient is a lot less because it's a lot longer stream bed. But if it's been channelized and simplified and diked and the Army Corps shoved it up against one side of the valley, you know, if that flow is too strong, they just can't dam it up. Or so often we've disconnected streams from their greater floodplains so much that there isn't really any way that a pond could get up and pond, because suddenly it would be flooding an alfalfa field or flooding a road or something like that. They in some tributaries that are pretty darn steep. Actually, here in Utah, there's some areas, there was some paper written about like the maximum gradient a beaver would build a dam on. But of course the beavers didn't read that paper, so they did what they wanted to. But yeah,
Well,
you nailed it.
that kind of fits with the Chief Joseph area out in eastern Washington off the Snake.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
see dams up in lower gradient stretches of steep areas.
Absolutely. And there are some times where they'll build them, and then every spring flood they blow out.
Mhm.
They'll build them again, like by midsummer when the flow is lower, and they'll hold some of that water back, and then they'll blow out. But if you think in terms of just like process-based dynamics of channel morphology, it's like we think, oh, it's a bad thing, it blew out, but really it's just another process of dynamism. So every time you do get a dam, it is slowing the water. You are accumulating sediment. You are racking up more vegetation, more sticks. And so then even when a dam blows out, it's creating this incredible nutrient and sediment pulse to then go out and scour something else. And maybe it carves over there and makes another meander, and then all the sediment drops. And then that pulse could clear the gravels, and then you suddenly have good spawning gravels. So when we start to think truly about the fluvial geomorphology and the dynamism of streams over millennia, dams being built and blowing out is actually a natural and a beneficial part of the process. It only becomes a problem if we have put a little teeny culvert in a bridge or a road or a barn or an alfalfa field right next to it, and then it's causing an issue for us. But yeah, even like huge debris flows and runoff from forest fires and all kinds of those things, rockfall, those are, we call it feeding the stream. Those are really critical inputs of dynamism and nutrients and more structure that the water can then knock all around and really kind of reinvigorate all those stream processes. So again, it's just, what do we do now when we have encroached so tightly on so many of our waterways? Can we find spots to intentionally back off a little? A friend and colleague of mine, Eric Geis, wrote a book called Water Always Wins. And it's really looking at, with the changes we're seeing in flow regimes and really intense storms, and what we used to think of as 50 or 100 or 200-year flood events now coming like every couple years, atmospheric rivers, the water's going to do what the water wants to do, and it might be expensive, but we're probably better off to start making some of those changes and upsizing culverts and backing off on our own terms in advance, as opposed to waiting for that next catastrophic event to kind of force us to do so.
I've seen beavers along our local C&O Canal here in the DC
Oh yeah.
area. And they must have bank lodges, because they don't build the big pile in the middle of the canal. But you see the trees that are getting eaten along the side and stuff. And I think it's really cool to be paddling along the canal in the really late afternoon when they come out and they start doing their beavery things. They're really cool animals.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. Is that the C&O Canal is kind of near like Great Falls?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay, I've been there. Yeah, totally. That's exactly the case. You really only see those really iconic conical kind of lodges when you really do have a pretty big pond. So those are pretty rare in most of the little streams, even where I am. We'll often see like hybrid structures where it's kind of like in a bank den, or they'll go under a root wad. So if there's like a big cottonwood, they can use that to almost be like their roof, so a bear can't claw in from the top, but they'll dig it out a little bit more and then almost like reinforce it with sticks like halfway on one side. So it's really just about trying to get shelter from predators. They're basically 50-pound chicken nuggets is how we like to talk about them. So they're just trying to eke out enough water depth that they can stay safe and not get eaten. And that's really too where then they start digging out side channels and canals, and that's where they really start expanding that wetland habitat. And that's really where a lot of the really great habitat is for, frogs and aquatic invertebrates and all these other critters. When you have these dug out canals that are getting little rivulets of water and then again slowing the water, and you're just getting so much nutrient buildup and all of those chemical processes from all the wetland vegetation. But that's just so that they can have, it's like a little water slide. They can way over there and chop down their aspen or their cottonwood and yank it back, to eat it or to put it in the dam. But it's fascinating when they've eaten up an area, they often let it rest and they'll move on. They'll go upstream or downstream. They let it rest. There's some really cool imagery you can pull up on Google Earth from an area near here. If you look up, it's called Spawn Creek up Logan Canyon, a tributary of the Logan River, where you can look at Google Earth over time and you see just the succession of the aspen and the cottonwoods where they hit an area and then they move on and they let it rest. But those kinds of riparian species, they coppice. So when they get nibbled, it's like they need that disturbance to regrow. So for aspen, it's either fire or beavers. And that surges this new growth, and you just end up with all these new shoots, and they leave it alone for 10, 20 years. You've got a whole new forest. And then they're up there and then they come back. And other areas where there's been no disturbance, there was a project where aspen that were only 5 inches in diameter, they were over 100 years old, and that aspen stand was dying because it had had no disturbance, because the fire had been cut off and it was just not even growing anymore, really. So it's like, oh yeah, this is how things co-evolved for millennia before, Western European colonizers came out here and even started taking notes and trying to measure things. Nature had a system. We're just trying to catch up and understand it. How closely related are muskrats? Oh, that's a fun question. I actually don't know in terms of like class, genus, those sorts of things. But muskrats are very sweet, and beavers actually let muskrats come into their lodges in the winter and like live with them, and they're friends. And so there's like a, oh gosh, what's it called? There's an organization. I think it is like a muskrat association, and they don't get nearly as much love as the beavers. But there are articles about benefits that muskrat provide, because they're doing little diggings and moving things around. So it's called an allochthonous input when you're bringing vegetation from the forest and you're bringing it into the stream. It's basically adding nutrients into the stream system. So muskrats contribute to that. They're awfully cute. Nutria though, Nutria are freeloaders. They don't do anything. All right, have I talked your ears off about beavers? Any other questions, or what do you think?
I think it's been great. I've really enjoyed it.
Good.
Both the video and the discussion.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Well,
thank you very much.
You're welcome. If anyone thinks of anything after the fact, again, you can reach me through the website, thebeaverbelievers.com. We got some fun stickers and different things for sale. We'll get DVDs up there again soon. But yeah, happy to follow up if anyone has any other questions. But thanks for having me. This has been fun. I only get out to Maryland and Virginia every couple years, but that still is like, where my family is. So it's fun.
Well, we certainly appreciate this. We try to have a balanced agenda here, from extreme white water to conservation to nature. You combined 2 of those categories, which I thought was pretty cool. And we keep on plugging for the little critters.
Oh, I will. I definitely will. Yeah, I've got all the silly background. You can't see things, but we got, here we go. All sorts of little beaver things. Well, actually here, you know, got a beaver skull, was out and found most of a skull. Actually, that dam behind me, that's the Bridge Creek area, which you saw in the film. And unfortunately, that skull was so intact. I'm pretty sure it was a human caused
Oh,
beaver death, but don't know for sure. But yeah, keep at it.
well, that's great. Well, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Probably if I see favorable comments,
Good.
rave
All right.
reviews.
Well, I've got my first round of finals next week for the first time in 25 years since the last time I was in school. So I'm gonna go try to remember how to study.
Good luck. I don't want to be in your shoes.
Oh, sometimes I wonder what did I do? But it's fun. Always never too old to keep learning. So I'll sign off, but thank you again so much for having me. I really appreciate the
Thank
chance to talk
you.
with y'all. Bye.
And I'm stopping the recording now.
All right. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.